Okay, so we're diving into something pretty important today, especially with the election coming up in 2025. We're going to take a deep dive into Peter Dutton and specifically his record on climate change and protecting the environment.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic, no pun intended.
Right.
You guys sent in a ton of articles and reports, and to be honest, some of it was pretty dense.
Oh, yeah.
But that's what we're here for, gonna break it all down, make it easy to understand, and hopefully even interesting.
So we've got Peter Dutton, the leader of the opposition, who has represented Dixon since 2001. Our goal today is to figure out where he stands on these crucial issues, climate and the environment. To start, maybe we can take a look at his voting record.
Yeah, that's always a good place to start. And I think what's really interesting is that when you look at his voting history, you see this pretty clear pattern. He consistently votes against anything that would reduce emissions or help us move to renewable energy sources.
Like, for example,
Well, a big one is the carbon pollution reduction scheme. That was a really important piece of legislation aimed at putting a price on carbon emissions, and he voted against it.
huh. So he doesn't seem to be a fan of those market-based approaches to climate action.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about his vote on the Emissions Reduction Fund. Didn't he actually support that one?
He did, and that might seem kind of contradictory at first glance,
It
right?
does.
But it actually tells us something really important about how he thinks we should tackle environmental problems. So with the Emissions Reduction Fund, we're talking about using taxpayer money to pay companies to reduce their emissions. That's different from a carbon price, where companies would essentially have to pay for their pollution.
So it's more about the how, not necessarily denying that climate change exists, right?
It's more about his preferred method for addressing the issue.
Okay, I see. So we've talked about climate change. What about protecting our natural resources? What's his record like on that front?
Well, that's where it gets even more complex. On one hand, he voted to give states and territories more power over environmental approvals. But then on the other hand, he consistently voted against any measures to strengthen the protection of our oceans and freshwater resources.
So more power to the states, but not necessarily when it comes to protecting our oceans and rivers. I'm not quite following that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher, right?
Yeah.
It could mean he prefers a more localized approach to environmental regulation, which might not sit well with people who want to see stronger national standards, especially on issues that cross state borders, like water security.
Hmm, that makes sense. You mentioned water security. What about the Murray-Darling Basin? That's a pretty critical issue for Australia, especially for those communities that rely on it for agriculture and just daily life. Where does Peter Dutton stand on that?
Well, he voted to increase the amount of water that could be taken from the Murray-Darling for things like farming and irrigation, a move that's faced quite a bit of criticism from environmental groups who argue it could put even more strain on this already fragile river system.
Right. And at the same time, he's voted against increasing protections for those freshwater resources. That seems like a bit of a disconnect.
It does, and it kind of highlights the challenge voters face when trying to understand his stance. How do you balance the needs of industries like agriculture with the long-term sustainability of our natural resources? There's no easy answer, and his voting record doesn't make it any clearer.
It sounds like we're already starting to see some pretty complex issues at play here. But we've only just scratched the surface. His voting record gives us some clues, but to really understand his stance on climate and the environment, we need to look beyond just the votes.
Yeah, I mean, voting records can only tell us so much, right? It's really important to look at what Peter Dutton has actually said about climate change and the environment. Sometimes those words can paint a different picture or maybe fill in some gaps.
Absolutely. I mean, actions speak louder than words, but words can still give us some valuable insights, especially when we're dealing with such complex issues like climate change. So what have you found? Any interesting statements or speeches from Peter Dutton on these topics?
Well, one thing that jumps out is his pretty strong opposition to international climate agreements. Like, he actually voted against Australia joining the Paris Agreement.
Wow, the Paris Agreement. That was a huge deal, right? Bringing together almost 200 countries with this shared goal of reducing emissions. So what do you think his opposition to that tells us about how he approaches climate action?
Well, it could suggest that he's not so keen on global efforts to tackle climate change. Maybe he prefers Australia to kind of go its own way. And that raises some interesting questions about how he sees Australia's role in the global fight against climate change, because it is a global issue, right?
Yeah, for sure. Climate change doesn't stop at borders. So if he's not a fan of these global agreements, what does he see as the way forward for Australia? Like, where does he stand on things like investing in renewable energy, which seems to be gaining so much traction around the world these days?
That's the million-dollar question, and I think a lot of Australians are wondering the same thing. Because when you look at his voting record, he's pretty consistently voted against any measures to boost investments in renewable energy.
Huh. So is he more in favor of sticking with the traditional energy sources?
Well, he has been a pretty vocal supporter of things like unconventional gas mining, including fracking.
Oh, fracking. Yeah, that's been a pretty controversial issue here, hasn't it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, some people argue it can boost domestic gas production and create jobs, right? But then others are really worried about the environmental risks, especially when it comes to things like groundwater contamination.
So it sounds like he's kind of betting on fossil fuels, even though the rest of the world seems to be moving towards cleaner alternatives.
Yeah, it does suggest that he's prioritizing those traditional energy sources over the rapid transition to renewables that a lot of scientists and experts are calling for. And that's something that voters really need to think about,
Hmm.
What kind of future do they want for Australia's energy sector?
The big question, no doubt. So we've got him voting against climate action, expressing some skepticism about renewables, and supporting things like fracking. That paints a picture of someone who maybe isn't fully on board with the need for urgent climate action, right?
That's certainly one way to interpret the evidence, but at the end of the day, it's really up to each voter to decide how much weight they give to these issues. How important are climate action and environmental protection to you? Do his positions align with your vision for the future of Australia? Those are the questions that voters really need to grapple with.
And I think that brings us to a really crucial point. We've been talking about his record, his statements, the votes, but we need to think about the bigger picture. What does all of this actually mean for Australia, for the environment, and for the people, especially those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? So we've spent this deep dive really digging into Peter Dutton's record on climate and the environment, and I think it's safe to say it's been pretty revealing. But now we need to ask the big question: what does it all mean for Australia?
That's really what it comes down to, right? I mean, we can look at all the votes and speeches, but what people really need to know is how this will actually impact their lives.
Exactly. So let's try to connect the dots here. We've seen this pattern of him resisting strong climate action, preferring traditional energy sources over renewables, and being skeptical of global cooperation on environmental issues. If that continues, what kind of future are we looking at for Australia's environment?
Well, it definitely raises some concerns about whether Australia can meet its emissions reduction targets. And those targets are crucial for mitigating the effects of climate change, which are already happening all over the country.
You're right. I mean, it's not just some abstract numbers on a piece of paper. We're talking about things like the bushfires that have been getting worse and worse, rising sea levels that threaten coastal communities. It's serious stuff. And what about the Great Barrier Reef? I mean, it's a national treasure that's extremely vulnerable to climate change. Does his record on protecting the environment give us much hope there?
Well, it's certainly something to consider if you care about protecting Australia's natural wonders. I mean, he voted against stronger marine conservation measures. He supports things like fracking, which could potentially harm water resources. It suggests that maybe environmental protection isn't his top priority.
So as we head into the 2025 election, this is about more than just casting a vote, right? It's about choosing the kind of future you want for Australia. Do we want to be leaders in tackling climate change, investing in clean energy, and safeguarding our environment? Or do we want something different?
That's the question every voter needs to ask themselves. We've laid out the facts about Peter Dutton's stance on these issues, but it's ultimately your decision. What matters most to you? What aligns with your vision for Australia's future?
And it's not just about listening to us. Do your own research, look at it from different angles, talk to people about it. This is a conversation we all need to be having because your vote is your voice and it matters.
Absolutely. This deep dive was just a starting point. There's so much information out there, from policy papers to expert opinions, all waiting to be explored. So stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay informed.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating look at the issues that shape our world.